Well, it was great to hear from Ambassador Hollyman about the big picture here, and now we're going to find out about what's really going on with some of the industries that are impacted. And our next panel is David Melbourne, Senior Vice President of Consumer Marketing and Corporate Social Responsibility for Bumblebee Seafoods. We've got James Day, who's a spokesperson for the American Headwear Alliance, and Charles Boustany, who's a spokesperson for Tariffs Hurt the Heartland, and a former member of Congress who served on the Ways and Means Committee. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to start with you, Dave, and really ask you to tell our audience a little bit about your company's operations, consumer base,
Sure.
in context of this conversation.
Well, first and foremost, we're proud to have been here in America for almost 120 years now. Bumblebee is an iconic heritage brand. We are in probably most households in one way or form in this country. We are the largest domestic canner of tuna here in the mainland. And our portfolio spans not just tuna, but all different types of seafood products. And 90% of our business is shelf-stable, so cans and pouches. We have, as I mentioned, we're the largest domestic canner of tuna. We have a plant in Santa Fe Springs, California. We also have a footprint in New Jersey. We're one of the largest clam manufacturers here in the U.S. as well. We employ about 500 people domestically within our business. And obviously our supply chain, which is mostly sourced, with the exception of a couple ingredients, from American suppliers when you get into packaging and corrugate. So we actually impact thousands of jobs across this country. So yeah, we're very happy to be American and produce most of our goods here in America.
Great, super. And Jim, can you tell us about some of your members in the same context, their operations and consumer base for your members?
Sure. So American Headwear Alliance is a coalition of companies that are in the cap and headwear industry in the United States. There are about 11 companies. We're represented in all 50 states, and we employ tens of thousands of people through the whole supply chain of these multiple factories and companies. We import goods from China that are both finished goods ready for sale, but we also import blank product that we decorate in local markets, and those local markets are where the most of those 10,000 associates and the logistics service providers come from. So headwear is in list 3. You know, it's a very specific commodity, and the implication of the taxes and the increased tariffs are going to hurt us and the consumer because while it's discretionary spending, most consumers aren't willing to spend an additional 25% on a ball cap perhaps, or a knit cap at, the cold weather games. Right. So we're concerned about what's happening, and we're trying to educate the administration in hopes of getting the exclusion process implemented so we can tell our story and hopefully retain our businesses and maintain our profits.
That's great. And Congressman Boustany, you're here representing Tariffs Hurt the Heartland. Can you talk a little bit about that organization and the impact on some of the companies and organizations affiliated?
Right, yeah, this is a grassroots organization. There are about 150 or 160 members representing the full spectrum of the American economy. Mm-hmm. Farmers for Free Trade is involved in this, so obviously a very big component of this is looking at agriculture and family farms right. across this country. Right. But we also have association members that are involved in retail and manufacturing. They're hit by supply chain issues. Mm-hmm. And so the whole purpose of this is to point out what's really happening across America in community after community. How many jobs are at stake with this? What is the financial impact with these businesses? I mean, we've seen information recently suggesting a big spike in farm bankruptcies. Right. We know a number of small and mid-sized firms are under severe strain as a result of the tariffs.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I'm going to, again, go back to you to start, Dave. Let's talk first about the impact on business and employees. Let's get to the business impact first, and we'll talk about consumers second. Sure. But just talk a little bit more about, you explain what your company does, but where's the real impact there?
Yeah, for a company our size, I mean, this is really approaching a critical moment for us. The few products that we actually import, the one in particular that has the greatest concern for us is an ingredient. Mm-hmm. For Bumblebee, and it's a tuna loin. We fully understand what the intent of the tariffs are, and the ambassador is correct. It is a tax, ultimately, on the American consumer. But in our situation, I think we have become the unintended consequence of this action. The product that we're bringing in, obviously, we hunt our species, we fish, and tuna swims around the equator. And you have to have initial processing facilities close to that fish supply. So there's one facility that we are currently working with, a fabulous partner in China, that we've been with for 5 or 6 years now. Our team worked with them to build a facility that meets our very tight specification, both in terms of quality, but also food safety. And again, this is an ingredient that we actually bring into California and use in our canning operation. The impact is severe. The tuna loin issue is close to a $20 million hit annually for profitability. There's just no way that we can incur that as an organization, and ultimately has really now forced us to look at our U.S. model in terms of production. Can we afford to stay domestic production? Again, we're the largest canner here in the U.S. Obviously, we pay significantly higher labor rates as a company, American employees, and when we're competing with other offshore suppliers that are at a fraction of our rate, there's just no way that we can compete long term, not with these things. And this latest round of tariff impact comes on the heels of the aluminum and steel increases. So, we weren't impacted by that personally, but our can suppliers were, which was passed on to us.
Right.
So the impact of that 10% is just rolling into the marketplace today. So it's highly problematic. And the other part of the unintended consequence, where we talk about the importance of creating American jobs. Our expansion plans, we've had growth plans on the table that we've been working through for the last couple of years to expand both our Santa Fe Springs, California facility and our Cape May, New Jersey facility, bringing value-added tuna products here for production. We source that today. Those finished goods from mostly Thailand, a couple other Pacific Rim countries, but we were looking to bring that and do that here. Again, the majority of what we do is American-made, and we feel really strongly about that. And with this round of tariffs, the expansion plans have all been tabled at this point. We can't even consider that. Now we're looking at, what is our long-term operation here on the mainland look like?
Wow. Jim, do you want to expand on that and talk a little bit about, the impact on your industry when it comes to the business side, the employees, and the financial side for your members?
Sure. So the coalition is represented by companies that are larger and smaller than each other. So the impact is different for every company within the American Headwear Alliance. However, the root fundamentals of the tariff increases are slowing growth, preventing expansion, as David mentioned, and potentially with the loss of volume in sales, reduction in jobs. And so we're trying, obviously to prevent that from happening. The implications are significant because the movement of manufacturing is not as simple as just selecting another factory.
Right.
And the retailers that we sell through have high requirements for social responsibilities. Our factories have to go through announced and unannounced audits to ensure that they treat factory workers fairly, that they work in healthy conditions, et cetera. And that's not something that you can recreate overnight. So the impact is significant. The efforts to try to mitigate these potential increases or additional increases in January are significant. And the impact to the businesses is already starting to hit. Some companies have already passed on price increases to their customers. Others are trying their best to absorb it, but it's inevitable when January 1st comes around that both manufacturers and customers are going to share in one way, shape, or form of shouldering this burden.
Can you expand on that a little bit when it comes to the 10% versus 25% in kind of the economic impact of that and what you're seeing already and what you anticipate seeing when it comes to January? And I'm going to ask you to start there, Jim, and we'll go down the row. But I think there's a little bit of question about what that means.
Sure. So prior to the first hit of 10% on average, headwear is about 7.5% duty. We're currently paying 17.5% duty. And January 1st will go to 32.5% duty. That's a significant impact to the whole financial structure of the industry. And we're just trying our best to look for alternatives. The factories that we've been partnering with, in some cases we've been partnering with for decades. These are significant partners. They're ethical people. They're hardworking, committed to making excellent product, in a quality product, in a safe way. So the the concerns are significant, and we're hopeful, that through these efforts we will try to get to that exclusion process.
Well, and you're seeing it already with 10%, but imagine what happens in January. And again, Dave, can you talk a little bit about the difference there even?
Yeah, I mean, the 10% is difficult enough. The 25% really is a game changer, as I mentioned, for our organization. I wish I could just take the footprint that I have today and move it. I can't do that. Jim mentioned, in addition to the complexities around food safety and quality, finding the right partner, building a facility, finding a supply chain that works is a good 18 months to 2 years. I mean, ultimately, we're going to have to try to do that if we don't get any resolution, but it's going to take time. And at $20 million a year, that 1 year of $20 million hit is so substantial. So we're hopeful that an exclusion process will be identified, at least giving us the opportunity to make our case. I think that we have a compelling case. I mean, this is a bit of a head scratcher for us. We're not IP, we're not technology. We're importing a food ingredient that we're actually using for production here in the United States. Again, I feel we have a very compelling story. But this whole process has been so interesting for me, understanding, obviously the implication for my company, but when you take a look at the implications that ripple across this country, it's not just the individual business that suffers, it is the entire supply chain that will be affected. And that is substantial. And the ambassador, I think, said it quite well. People just don't understand what this means.
Right.
They don't understand it. They hear about it.
They really don't.
I probably didn't fully understand it until I was thrust into the scene a month and a half ago. But it is going to have devastating consequences. And I know we haven't talked about the consumer yet, and we'll get there, but that's my concern.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you, Congressman, do you want to talk a little bit about the Heartland? So talk about the business and the economic implications for the Heartland and some of the, organizations you're working with.
Right. Well, first of all, you heard two very good examples of the collateral damage coming from this tax, and it's a very disproportionate and growing collateral damage that's going to hit every aspect of our economy. We at Tariffs Hurt the Heartland have a tariff tracker. We started doing this, and we saw a significant. We're using government data, so it's acceptable, accepted data with regard to the impact, the economic impact of these tariffs. And what we've seen is a significant jump in the fall from August to September to October. And I think from August to September was a $1.4 billion increase in this tax across the spectrum of the economy. At the end of October, we saw roughly about a $4.4 billion total impact, and that's going to grow. It did not even include some of the data from the last round of taxes, which were just put in place, or tariffs, which were put in place in mid-September. So that impact's going to grow. To bring it back to home, take a farmer down in Louisiana. This is a real example. 1,700 acres of soybeans. He had to plow over 1,000 acres. He couldn't find a buyer. He tried to find storage facilities, could not find the storage facilities, and he's left with this. So all he did was he took the loss, plowed it over, and that's on one farm in Louisiana. If you take the soybean industry across the board in this country, which is a pretty substantial agricultural sector, you're seeing this repeated, state by state, farm by farm. That impact's going to grow. For manufacturers, we have a lot of small, mid-sized manufacturers, and Dave is right about the supply chain. The impacts are immense, and I don't think anybody really fully understands the implications as this hits across all supply chains, and especially as it goes to the consumer level. One final point, with the List 3, I heard about a company, it's a medical manufacturing company. They make equipment that's essential for X-ray imaging. They are being hit. They need an exclusion on this, and so far there's no exclusion process. And it's going to cost this company quite a bit of money, but the repercussions for the healthcare industry will be immense, where hospitals won't be able to buy the upgraded material or machinery to do this type of medical imaging. So from healthcare to agriculture to manufacturing, electronics, this apparel and so forth, this is going to be very pervasive, and it will escalate if the next steps are taken.
Why don't you continue on and let's talk a little bit about the consumers. So obviously that's the end game, the end of the chain. You know, I think about buying hats or buying tuna fish and the things that I already am worried about as a consumer. Why don't you talk a little bit about what you see, Congressman, and then we'll go down and hear from everybody on the consumer impact.
Right. Well, I think we're just starting to see the early headwinds with regard to the effect on consumers. And if we go to the 25% level in January, it's going to be pretty significant. It's really going to start to hit. There are some early data suggesting Christmas sales were down, Black Friday and so forth. We'll have to wait the data, but I suspect, these tariffs, that last list came in fairly late, so the impact really hasn't been felt yet. We're going to see that, especially if we see a 25% bump, and it will affect consumer electronics, something that Americans are quite accustomed to buying fairly cheaply. Certainly clothing, apparel, it's going to be very pervasive.
Jim, so give me an example when it comes to hats. So when I go to buy a ball cap for the Capitals, I'm a big Capitals fan, what's that going to mean for me? Is it in terms of price? And how is that going to impact me now and then also come January?
Well, as I said earlier, there are companies within the American Headwear Alliance that have already passed on cost increases to their customers, and ultimately the consumers going to absorb those costs.
It's like, are we talking about a couple of dollars? How much are we talking about? Am I gonna really notice that?
Depending upon the company involved, it's going to be a 25% increase.
Wow.
Right. So you're talking, significant money. Over $30 potentially for a ball cap, and a family going to a game or whatever it might be might not be able to afford that. And so because it is discretionary spending. Right. People might choose to go in a different direction or save their money or not go down that road. A family of four, right. 25% more across however many heads is going to add up and is ultimately going to result in lost sales.
Right. And how about on your end?
I spend 90% of my time on consumer advocacy, not here in DC. Do a lot of industry work advocating for the consumer in terms of health and wellness. What folks need to understand is that canned tuna is probably one of the most affordable sources of lean protein available today. In all my work fighting obesity and childhood obesity and looking at who these consumers are, we're not talking about the 1%. We are talking about average, hard-working American families that are trying to determine how to put food on their table. Right. They can go to a can of tuna and have the health benefit, the solid nutrition that comes from that, tuna's not a high margin business, so
Right.
there's not a whole lot of room. And I really worry about the folks that are going to be affected, and particularly older Americans and lower income Americans.
That's what I was going to say. I would think that too.
It's going to be a devastating impact for them. And you know, I mean, I've been talking about this for a long time about, you know, why tuna is so important. And the other thing we need to also remember, we're at a point in time where we have a health crisis in this country. We have terrible things happening, and when you take a look at the U.S. dietary guidelines in 2015, it's the first time that the guidelines came out and advocated that consumers are woefully deficient in their seafood consumption. And they are looking and promoting and trying to push consumers to the point where they're incorporating 2 to 3 servings per week. Well, the average American probably can't afford to go out and buy salmon fillets and some of these other higher cost solutions. Canned tuna is very economical, and again, it really services those that are struggling, and they will feel the impact. Absolutely will feel the impact. No question.
And do you think they're feeling it already, or do you feel like it's going to be a big deal in January?
Well, to the point, I mean, there are already starting to see it, you know, based on the aluminum and steel increases that went into effect, that 10%, that's just rolling into the marketplace now. With the 10% on this list 3 that we are now part of with tuna loins, specifically, that went into effect on September 24th. So that will begin rolling in probably in the beginning of next year. The 25%, again, I don't even know what we're going to do with the 25%, how much of that gets passed on, and that effect will kind of ripple through Q1 into the balance of next year. So it's going to be meaningful, and it's going to be quick. We don't have a big window of time, particularly when you get to the 25% window. I mean, the 25% is just massive.
Wow.
Just massive, and it will be the American consumer that feels that impact.
Yeah. So brace ourselves.
American consumer, and nobody's really talking about that. Yeah, we're all worried about businesses and keeping jobs and expanding and increasing domestic production capabilities, but it's the consumer that's going to be the loser in this situation.
So one of the things, you know, you hear, you say, okay, we heard all this. Why can't you just move all your Chinese manufacturing back to the U.S.? It seems like, okay, we see the problem. Is there a simple solution? Maybe you could start, Dave, and we can, you know, kind of go down the line and see what your reaction to that is.
Sure. As I mentioned, the tuna loin issue for us is what we're working in China for right now. Long term, we can look to move that sort. And again, what we're not even getting final. This is an ingredient. The fish is caught. It's moved to an initial processing facility. So Eastern Pacific fish, we actually initially process in China. Western Pacific fish, we process in Fiji, and Indian Ocean fish, we process in Mauritius. And the whole fish goes in. It's cut. It's cleaned. You have lines of 1,500 to 2,000 workers that literally hand clean every tuna that comes into the facility by hand. They debone, they polish, they have to be very careful so they don't bruise the meat. They then take the tuna, put it into bags, flash freeze that, and then it's sent to our cannery. Picking up our operation right now is really not feasible to do it quickly. There are certain other products that we do source from China. They're finished goods product. We could do some canned oysters, some canned crab, and some canned shrimp. That supply chain, we can pivot on pretty quickly. We're going to feel the impact under just this 10% for a period of time. And again, with fisheries, you have certain harvest periods. You know, you can't just go and say, okay, I want to can some clams today. It depends on
not clam day today.
It's not clam day today. It depends on when that fishery is scheduled to be harvested. You know, my advocacy over the last month and a half hasn't even revolved around some of these other products, because again, we can pivot fairly quickly. The tuna loin issue, we cannot. We cannot.
Jim, how about you?
Yeah, so the cut and sew industry, and headwear is part of that industry, started leaving the United States decades ago. With it, the textile industry also started moving overseas as well. So a few things impact us in being able to move. First and foremost is the available capacity and quality of manufacturing. And then secondly, the availability of labor. And so when you look at the cut and sew industry, that's a very meticulous job. It's very hand-eye coordinated. It's not a high-tech job. And even in markets like China and in other countries throughout the world, trying to find cut and sew labor is extremely difficult. So it's not something that we could bring back to the United States and do so in a way that would allow us, number one, to be effective at producing, and then secondly, still make money in this business. So in addition to that, as I said, there's a regulatory aspect of the manufacturing supply chain that we all utilize to make sure that they're working in very ethical and controlled and safe environments, and that isn't built overnight. That's something that's learned skill. It's a commitment by the factory management and ownership, and it's not found just anywhere. And so the relationships that we have with our factory partners around the world are near and dear to us. They're built through cooperation and collaboration in making excellent products, and it's just not something that you could bring back to the United States and do effectively.
One thing I'm realizing as we talk more and more about this, it's complicated. It seems like it would be an easy solution, just bring it back. Well, it's clearly not in any of these cases. I don't know, Congressman, do you have anything from your membership to add to that?
Right. We've held a number of town hall meetings all across the country. I think we've done 10 to date, one coming up in Georgia next week, Louisiana to follow, and more slated to come, to hear these stories, to understand what's really happening across America. And what repeatedly comes out of this is our whole notion of the American dream. When you think of the American dream, you think of a family farm that's passed on from one generation to the next, or a small manufacturing company that gets passed on maybe in the third, fourth, or fifth generation. Mm-hmm. These are the companies these are the farms and companies that are at risk. And I mean, if you think about a family farm, when it goes away, what happens? Yeah. That's not something you can just take and move overseas. Right. I mean, that's a source of pride for the U.S. Secondly, it's a source of trade surplus for the U.S. One of our strong suits is our agricultural community and our exports. And what we saw back in September, I think, was a 26% drop in exports. That's not healthy for the American economy. So this is complicated. Farmers are caught up into the supply chain. Those supply chains don't come back. Same thing with small manufacturers who depend on certain inputs to be successful. If we lose this, we will continue to see a deterioration in our economy across this country it'll be very difficult to get back. Mm-hmm. And so it's important as we look at what's going on, you want economic growth, but you want that economic growth to not just be felt in the coastal cities, it's got to be felt across the United States. Mm-hmm. These policies with the collateral damage coming from tariffs is very harmful. There's a better way to deal with China, a more targeted way to deal with China that could be much more effective. And so when you weigh the collateral damage to the American people, the consumer, the farmers, the producers, the manufacturers, and look at it respectively with respect to the gains, we're on the wrong track right now. Yeah. We have to change tracks. Yeah.
So let's pivot to that. Obviously, we talked a little bit with the ambassador about the meeting coming up with President Trump and President Xi. What's the best outcome? I'm going to start with you, Congressman. Like, what would be our wish for that
well,
meeting?
I think Ambassador Holloman gave a pretty good explanation of this. The two are not going to basically negotiate a comprehensive deal, but if they basically create a pathway that gets the different agencies in our respective governments working through the difficulties here and staves off the next increase in tariffs, and both sides work in good faith to actually get to an acceptable outcome, that's really the best we can hope for coming out of this. The question is, will that happen? And it's anybody's guess as to what the dynamics will be. I'm very concerned that not much will come out of this. My concern is that while the administration is really focused on coercive measures, less so on negotiation to get to this, to what extent is there really a strategy to get to an acceptable end game whereby China does correct the abusive practices, they take remedial steps to stop IP theft, force technology transfers, unfair subsidies and so forth? That's going to be a long game. It's not going to happen between now and the next election. It may take the rest of the century really to get to something. But what we need is a pathway that shows progress and stops the collateral damage. That's what I'm hoping to see. I hope to see statements that suggest that that's the path our government and the Chinese government will take. That would be a successful outcome.
And do you think from that would come the exemptions that we're hoping, at least for Section 3? Is that what you think will come out of that?
Yeah, it's difficult to know what's going to happen with the exclusion process, especially for the third list. I know Senator Toomey's pushing for an exclusion process. There are other senators looking at trying to push the administration to do this. I think Ambassador Holloman was correct in that the first two lists were very targeted. This third list is bigger, and it's taxing USTR's capacity to manage an exclusion process. That's one facet. Secondly, there's probably a willingness on the part of USTR and the administration to withhold on the exclusion process, to use that as a point of leverage in the negotiations. That's a possibility. So it's unclear, but I think congressional pressure is going to grow for a list 3 exclusion list. But then you have the problem of implementing it and doing it in a timely way so that American companies and farmers are not hurt in the process.
What are you hearing? I know you've been on the Hill, a lot of you, talking to some of the members of Congress on that note. So what are you hearing? And what's the mood up there in terms of helping with the exclusion process?
Well, from my standpoint, I started meetings at the end of September. Again, I don't do this normally. And I have to say, I'm actually very encouraged. The first week or so of meetings, it was very interesting because this was not an issue that many of these staffers were up to speed on. I think this happened so quickly, and there were very few voices coming in telling the story. So we found probably in the first week and a half, 2 weeks, it was all about education. It was giving them an example. Here's an American company. This is what is happening to us. We are the collateral damage of this. This was not the intention, we understand that, but really trying to help them understand the issue and to quantify the issue. And really just the ask was, we really need we should have the right to an exclusion process. There's been a process for all the other tariffs, and all we're asking for is that there's a process. And what has been really encouraging is as the weeks moved on and we did more and more meetings, there's a sense of bipartisan support there, both on the House side and the Senate side. They now, a month and a half later, they're hearing this, they're seeing it, they're having their constituents come in and present very clear. This is a really easy story, right? I mean, this is not something that you're trying to spin. I mean, this is real life. This is a major impact, and I can put a face on this issue with all of our employees. I can put a face on this issue for lower income families that are trying to put food on their table every day, and canned tuna is one of the things that they can count on, even in the food deserts.
Right.
So that story has really resonated with folks on the Hill, and I'm actually really proud of the response that we're getting. They've taken the time. They've taken the time to meet with us. They've taken the time to hear the issue. They've asked some very thoughtful questions. They've actually reached back out to us as they learn more. And since we first started this dialogue, and Bumblebee is just one of many that are out there advocating for this exclusion process, we've seen movement in the House with the original sign-on letter. We saw movement in the Senate with sign-on letters going to USTR asking and requiring an exclusion process. So this is starting to amplify, and again, I just think it's the reaction we have received has been tremendous, and I'm very grateful that the folks, the staffers that we've met with, they understand the issue and they're going to do what they can.
And Congressman, you've obviously, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked the ambassador. You've had a front row seat to this, obviously, in your past career, and as part of the Ways and Means Committee specifically. You know, where do you see it going? And do you see that Congress is supportive of the exclusion process, and you think that that's something that's going to get some momentum in the next Congress?
Make a couple of observations. I focused on trade policy, so when I was on the Ways and Means Committee, I was very comfortable getting into the weeds and technicalities of it. But most members of Congress don't spend the time on that particular issue unless it affects someone in their district, a company or companies or an industry in their district. So the best way to influence Congress on this whole issue is to tell the stories. When I was a member of Congress, the most effective advocacy was when individuals came from the state of Louisiana to explain to me what was going on, and then I subsequently visited their facility, met their employees and the people affected by this, saw what they were doing. That stuck with me. Whereas when you talk about abstract policy, members of Congress have, hundreds of priorities heaped upon them every day. Everything's a priority, and how do you set your own priorities is a real challenge. And so what David just described is exactly the best way to influence the process. Now, Congress has been slow to come to the table on this issue because the administration was dominating it. They imposed the tariffs. They claim that they have a strategy to get an acceptable outcome. And so many members of Congress in both parties did not want to really question whether there was a strategy. They wanted to give the president the benefit of the time to say, okay, let's see how this works. But as the pain level is increasing and the collateral damage that's ensuing from this occurs, well, Congress is starting to awaken to the impacts in their districts, in their states, and that is going to be most impactful in the long run because congressional pressure on the president and his administration is the way that we'll get to a better balance on policy and maybe eliminating the collateral damage of tariffs and looking at more targeted ways to deal with China.
And so there's been some rumor about another list. Congressman, have you heard this rumor, and what do you think the likelihood of that is?
Well, there's a list, another one, and it's the additional $267 billion, which would hit basically the entire list of imports coming from China, but that will have a tremendous impact across the U.S. economy with regard to inputs in the supply chain and in terms of the consumer impact, which will be immense. So I'm hopeful we don't get to that, but the threat is out there, and my understanding is that USTR is working on that list.
So it sounds like the consensus is we're hoping that there's going to be an exclusion process for this list, and I'm going to ask each of you, I'm going to start with Jim, to talk about if that happens, let's hope for the best there, what would be your pitch?
Well, it's really the same story that we've been telling. It's multi-generational family businesses that are being impacted by this. These aren't huge corporate, entities that are billions and billions of dollars, and these are impacting, the American dream, as the congressman had said. So, those stories that we've been telling on the Hill, being very receptive, we're really ultimately hopeful that they'll be heard. While we support the administration's goals for the tariffs and the idea of protecting intellectual property, national security, bringing jobs back to the United States, we agree with all those things. It's the application of this tariff proposal that is really off base, in our opinion, is actually going to undermine those goals. When you look at headwear specifically, there's nothing technologically advanced. It's all open construction. You can see the seams in a hat. So there's nothing, that's of technology or national security. And as I said, the jobs are the biggest concern, and we're hopeful that we'll be heard on this.
Great. Congressman?
I would just say that that if you claim to represent the people of this country and you understand what's really going on and the collateral damage that that's occurring as a result of this particular approach to the problem that we're seeing with China, if you believe in the wisdom of the people who deal with this, the day-to-day business of America, then you'll understand that the level of risk that we're imparting on the American economy and the collateral damage coming from it outweighs the benefit of this approach, because we haven't seen China change its behavior. Right. I mean, the USTR report that just came out subsequently has shown that none of this has actually had an impact on Chinese behavior. So it's time to reassess. Is this an effective strategy? What is the damage being done? And what's a better way to do this? And I think listening to the stories of these two gentlemen and many, many others across this country will have a real impact.
Absolutely. Dave, do you want to?
Yeah, from our standpoint, again, it's the story I've told today. It's the impact to a heritage brand, an old American brand that is proudly produced. The majority of our tuna products are produced here in this country, as well as a lot of other types of seafood items. And again, it's pointing out what the reality versus what the intent was. So clearly, if I get that opportunity to go through an exclusion process, I'll point that out. But again, here I think, particularly in our situation, the impact to the consumer is so critical. I mean, this is this problem that we have. I mean, talk about healthcare, you talk about all these other issues. I mean, this is not just a black and white element. And quite frankly, List 3 came through so quickly, and it was just a broad brush. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was no thought, really. Yeah. I mean, I'm not hearing that there was any thought to this. It was a broad brush to get to a number, and that's why it's important to tell our story. Mm-hmm. Because again, it wasn't the intention. Mm-hmm. I honestly believe that was not the intention. And it's really pointing that out, yeah. And making sure that they're aware. I also agree with the Congressman. The other element is just the capacity for USTR to deal with these exclusions and this whole issue. It's significant when you have as many companies, particularly with List 3, that are now part of this issue, that they can actually manage through a process. I'm happy to help them with that.
Absolutely. Maybe they'll call you.
I'm more than happy. If anybody would like to set up some meetings, I definitely have some ideas.
That's great. Yeah. Well, with that, we're going to turn it to the audience and see if anyone has any questions. Sure.
Thank you. Leah from Voice of America's Mandarin Service. I have two questions, one for the industry representatives. I'm wondering if you have talked with the administration officials and what kind of reception have you had on these impacts of the tariffs. Now, the question for Congressman is that you mentioned that there are better ways to deal with this problem with China, but then we also hear arguments like that this is really the last resort because China doesn't engage in good faith negotiations. Even with these coercive measures, we still don't see any changes in China's behavior. So can you talk a little bit more about what is the right approach to deal with China?
You guys want to start?
You want to go first?
So access to the administration is very difficult to get to. We've been trying to leverage relationships from Capitol Hill in order to get our story heard in hopes that it gets told directly to representatives of the administration. So we've not had the opportunity to speak with them directly.
Our situation, again, this came so quickly for us that we did provide written comments when this went into effect, actually 2 separate written comments. We never heard anything back. From what our understanding was, there were so many letters that came in, they just went into a big pile, and I'm not even sure they were even read. We have tried to reach out to set up a meeting, a face-to-face, just to try to understand the situation, and particularly earlier on when it first happened, to really try to understand the context and the spectrum. But they just weren't taking any meetings.
I think the question of whether China will change its approach is still an open question. And the key is to test China's intention to change effectively. I don't think it's going to be possible for the United States to take unilateral action and get a real result. I think it's really going to require building an effective coalition of countries to demonstrate to China that their practices are outside of global norms, not just the United States view of global norms, but true global norms consistent with the EU, Japan, South Korea, other allies and big economies. And then devising a framework to test their intentions, using economic diplomacy combined with some coercive measures that are much more targeted than just blunt tariffs. But this means building a coalition, and the administration has not shown the kind of effort and effectiveness in putting that type of coalition together. I think ultimately that would be a much more effective way. Now, we do have some unilateral tools that we could hit particular entities with in China that would get their attention. I mean, most recently, they used a nuclear option with ZTE. It certainly got the Chinese leadership's attention. But there are ways, underneath that to target certain elements in China that would get their attention without causing a lot of collateral damage to American companies. And I think combining that approach with a coalition that uses the WTO, uses other international institutions, would be the most effective way to test whether China will actually change its position. And if it won't, then I think we'll end up seeing something such as what Secretary Paulson described, where we'll see some level of disengagement. And then we have to understand how to manage that. And if we are going to go that route, because China's not going to change, I'd rather do it with allies and consolidated supply chains, flexible supply chains. If we go into it unilaterally, and our trading partners are asked to hedge and play both sides, I don't think the American consumer and American businesses and farmers will benefit from that approach. So we want to go in with supply chains behind us and international support.
That's great. Dave, you're going to add
One thing to add to my last response, I was referring to USTR. I think we have to look at the administration more broadly. And there are a number of agencies, and we've actually had some very positive conversations with several agencies, and they understand our situation. Again, we're putting a face on this and what this impact looks like. So I want to make sure you walk away with the fact that it's not that the administration's unwilling to talk. I think USTR, again, they're overwhelmed, and I think a big part of this is a negotiation. But you look at USDA as an example, and I talked about the dietary guidelines. I mean, they're advocating for healthier eating. They're advocating for increased seafood consumption. They want pregnant moms and nursing moms to increase their intake of seafood for that fetus and that developing child. And I would love to see a point where you had multiple touch points within the administration that do understand the potential ripple effects to also express, even if they don't want to be out publicly on this issue, what can they do internally? How can they, grab the ear of the president and/or other folks to really, again, focus on the U.S. consumer, and they don't have to take a public stand on it, but they can certainly do it internally.
And similarly, there was a joint committee on trade, and there was an open dialogue, an opportunity to testify in front of that joint committee on trade. I was fortunate to be able to do that. I think it was back in September, early September, right? So that's an opportunity that the administration did provide. However, as David said, haven't heard back.
Thank you. Yep.
Hi, Marilee, International Trade Today. My question is for David. I really appreciate you giving specifics. That helps a lot. You are using this 20 million number for the impact. Is that on the 10% or the 25%?
That'll be the 25%.
Okay, and then to give us context, your business is a pass-through, so the tax rate was reduced from 39% and changed to 20% with the tax cut. How does the amount of savings on the profits on the tax cut compare to the scope of the increase in taxes on the tariffs?
Thank you for that question, and it's not something I can answer. I'm happy to get back to you on that, but yeah, I just don't have all the details in front of me at this point.
Thank you. Jeff Pike, we represent a number of seafood industries. One thing you haven't talked about today is the retaliatory tariffs. We represent lobstermen who were hit with a 25% retaliatory tariff when the first tranche went in. And China's about a $150 million market a year for export of live lobsters. Is the impact of these retaliatory tariffs having any impact on this debate in terms of an exclusion process?
Well, the retaliatory tariffs are real. We've seen it in the ag community side. It's been a very big factor, especially with soybeans and so forth. Most of the exclusion process discussion has revolved around necessary inputs or inputs through importation that are necessary for a manufacturing process. So key parts of the supply chain. For the ag side, they've talked about this additional aid under the Farm Bill, which is paltry compared to the damages, and I'm not even aware that there are those kinds of programs for seafood. So seafood is getting hit by retaliatory tariffs, and there's no remedy right now to deal with it. I don't know, Dave, you might.
Honestly, in our situation, it doesn't apply to us. We're not doing any export to China specifically. Sorry.
Sorry. Dan Newman with Serenity Samet. So, we've seen a lot of comments. There's a little bit of negotiating in the press going on in the lead up to this meeting. The Chinese ambassador just had a statement this morning that outcomes need to be win-win, sort of pushing back on Kudlow's statement from yesterday about concessions. So, Congressman, what's your best guess looking into next week? What are we more likely to see? An exclusion process for List 3 or the rollout of List 4?
I don't think we'll see the rollout of List 4 just yet because they're still working on it. But the president has that threat out there. I think there's growing congressional pressure to develop an exclusion list for List 3, and I think that's probably going to come. So that would be more likely in the short run, in my opinion. But I'm speculating to some extent.
Yeah, I hope you're right.
Yeah.
One of my concerns with a List 4 is that as we've been advocating for, obviously, the List 3 exclusion process, that just becomes, there's going to be so much more noise that, getting anybody to even think about or focus on, the little guys here in terms of getting this exclusion for List 3 just won't be a priority or top of mind. They'll be dealing with so many other issues. And we've been talking about that proactively in our meetings.
Yeah, I think the other concern is we've had a couple successes getting things off lists.
Right.
If they come back with a List 4, do those then become fair game again? Do car seats go back on, they got pulled off List 3, things like that? That becomes a real question.
Right. Well, that's a good question, but I think if they go to List 4, everything's going to be, it's going to include everything, and then it's all about trying to scramble to get exclusions. And based on Commerce's experience with exclusions, it hasn't been good. And USTR is a much smaller agency with less capacity. They're having to bring people in from other agencies to try to manage this, and they're struggling, with the first two lists with exclusions. List 3 is bigger, and List 4 will be immense. This is creating a lot of extra work, and it's very, very complicated. I mean, you're basically assuming that somebody working on the exclusion process, or collectively the work being done on the exclusion process, is omnipotent. They know the business. They know what's a necessary input that can't be brought in from elsewhere, and what's not. And there's not enough expertise in those agencies to do that. That's just that's really a very ineffective way to go about the process.
I filed an exclusion on List 1, so the $34 billion list, so 10% roughly of List 3, on October 9th, and it posted publicly, meaning it was just read to make sure there were no naughty words in it. so that they could begin the process yesterday. So 2 months to get through.
Yeah.
Any last questions before we conclude today? I'm going to give the panelists one last word, as that's my prerogative. And just kind of, I'll start with you, Dave. Just any kind of last comments about the process and kind of what you're hoping for.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. Very nice to have you take the time to do it. My parting comment is we need a voice, and we need to amplify this message. And it's so nice I just met these two gentlemen for the first time, and I give them both a lot of credit. I give the larger coalition a lot of credit, really trying to put a face on this, and digging through what may have seemed pretty straightforward and easy, what the actual implications are, and that's my greatest wish. And I think if we get the exclusion process, we're going to have that opportunity to tell this story, and it's going to be my job to do it in a compelling way. But we definitely need that process.
Yeah. Jim?
Yes, I echo David's comments. It's our hope that the exclusion process comes to fruition, that we have the opportunity to tell our story, because I do believe it was an oversight, in the application of this policy, without any real understanding of how it will impact everyday Americans, family businesses, and consumers. So the opportunity to tell that story, to have a fair practice consistent with the previous lists, is going to be important, and we're hopeful that that opportunity presents itself quickly.
I want to extend my appreciation to these two gentlemen for taking time to be a part of this and sharing their experience. They're absolutely right. We really have to show the full impact of this across the country, not just big companies and Wall Street. This has to be a full, thorough American discussion about an immense challenge, a challenge that we're facing with China. It's a complicated challenge. And so we need to understand that this is not just abstract policy that's being put together in Washington. This is actual policy that has a direct impact and potentially, well, certainly has, what's being done now, has tremendous collateral damage, because these are taxes on American business. We need a full discussion on what is really the best way to deal with the challenge of China in a targeted way without the immense collateral damage, and how do you mitigate what damage does occur to American businesses and farms, which means the exclusion process. So I think I'll just end there. We've kind of beat on this constantly, but that's the message. And it's not just a dominant policy decision that the president and his team can make. This has to be a full American discussion about what is the best thing for our future.
Thank you. Well, thank you to our panelists today, and to our sponsor, Americans for Tax-Free Tuna, and to the Press Club for being a gracious host. Appreciate everything. Panelists are going to stick around for a few minutes, and we can talk individually, but I think that concludes the formal presentation. So thank you all.